Hello, and welcome to another episode of DLT's ContinuousX podcast, where we solve for X in the SDLC equation. My name is Rick Stewart, and I'm joined here today by my guest host, Mike Fitzurka, and our special guest is Chris Randvere. Chris has over 30 years experience in the IT industry and is currently a solutions architect at RedGate Software. RedGate makes life easier for development, operations, and IT leaders by solving the database challenges in delivering software at speed. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you.
Well, we'll start off with the questions, and Mike will start answering. And any incorrect question, Chris, your bank account will be deducted $100.
Good.
Excellent. So a challenge round. All right. So, Chris, we've seen a lot of DevSecOps presentations, and they almost always ignore the 400-pound gorilla in the room, and that's your database, because, there's these great presentations on transforming to microservices, which is all stateless, and then you run into the problem of a giant state engine, your database. So what can you do? What can you tell us about, and tell our listeners about what they can do to address the needs effectively in a DevSecOps transformation when you're looking at the giant state engine in your stateless system?
This is a good question. This is a challenge, that I'm not just myself, but I think everybody within pre-sales here at RedGate are starting to have more and more of those types of conversations. I think many of my customers are obviously trying to work to improve the architecture, working to break up those legacy monolithic databases, which have become, bottlenecks. At the same time, we're also seeing the importance of being able to continue to deliver those features while they change, that architecture. Also wary of going all in on microservices, I think, to the point where they end up with a similarly difficult to manage environment, with the opposite problem from where they began. I do see some things that customers are doing to try and get ahead of this. I think the first kind of thing you might want to start to look at is maybe starting off all of those new projects as microservices. I would say maybe try to bring in those legacy databases into things like version control and pipelines using, modern techniques to increase that development flow, be able to identify code problems maybe earlier on in the life cycle, reduce also, lead time for those developments, or I should say those deployments, me. Leveraging automation, data virtualization, storage technology to maybe remove pains that, are presented with being able to quickly refresh and present those environments back down, to developers and testers. Maybe also trying to identify certain components that are currently using those monolithic databases and see if we can maybe split those off. Those are probably the first four things that immediately come to mind that I know that we recommend to those customers facing those challenges for sure.
Awesome. Four, top of mind. Nice. Speaking of microservices, Chris, we've heard that the guidance that for every microservice, they should have their own data store or database, presumably with their own DBA. Within the public sector, there are challenges obtaining these technical resources. Is that even feasible? And if so, what can help?
Yeah, good question as well. I think this is a challenge not just in the public sector, but the private sector as well. What can one do with the challenges that we are presented with? I think one of the value adds to what RedGate can do there is with the introduction of automation for that database, we're going to start to include different areas that provide visibility, control, and repeatability, along with security,
right,
with that workflow. What do I mean by that? Let's introduce that database into some kind of source controlling system. Okay, this is where we can have complete visibility to the version and have everybody collectively making changes to that environment be aware of those changes. And then when we take those changes higher and higher as far as deployments are concerned, what can we introduce to give those DBA challenged environments the ability to deploy more securely, deploy more repeatably. I dare say more happily in terms of deployments, because what ends up happening here is that we're putting in these automated functions where we historically have always had an individual or some manual operations take over. Now we're introducing that into an automated workflow, still acknowledging all of the checks that we need to acknowledge as it pertains to a deployment. But now we're not worried about those deployments now. We're not going to have our fingers crossed as I deploy and find out that we've uncovered a bug or we've uncovered some issue that we just didn't find out earlier on in the life cycle. These types of tools that RedGate provides allow for that to happen and give those environments that are challenged with that workforce or lack of workforce, I should say, the ability to enjoy those benefits without having those dedicated individuals.
Yeah, I love that expression, because one of the qualitative aspects of DevOps or DevSecOps is joy in the workforce. The culture and the morale that you're building builds upon itself, and where you can extend that into not only just application development, but the associated database. And I'm fully in agreement with that. Joy has to be part of the recipe, so to speak, or at least the outcome, as opposed to just a nice to have. It should be a direct target.
Definitely.
Completely agree.
So, Chris, you mentioned source control management and relation to the database. And so, of course, a single source of truth is very important to a DevSecOps culture. But how do you balance that with the production environment, which might have PII or other security concerns? And how do you replicate that in so your development can enjoy the same benefits in DevSecOps, but still maintain security?
Yeah, very, very good question. Also very challenging for, a majority of our customers, because this is something that I think really started to get some traction about 18 months ago. I think with the inception of GDPR, remember when GDPR was being spoken about, this is when I first came into RedGate. This was something that all of our customers now had to be prepared for, because historically, obviously, if I'm refreshing production, in order for that development and testing cadence to continue, these folks realistically would like to do that development and test work in a production-like environment.
Right.
Okay. The challenge is now, obviously, because of GDPR and SOX and HIPAA and all the other compliance aspects we need to deal with, we can no longer provide production data, or production data should not be outside of production anymore. So what do we do to not become another bottleneck now in that workflow? These are very challenging circumstances to try and solve for. Luckily, I think RedGate has a very decent story here. We have products within our portfolio that have taken that into consideration. I think a lot of what my customers are doing now is leveraging things like this virtualization at this point, being able to take an environment, take an image of that environment, and while I'm taking that image, I might want to now introduce some other security aspects like masking of that data, being able to provide those environments back down to development and test after a refresh with production data, so they can do those effective development and test jobs, but not be commingling with production data. This is probably the best way that we can facilitate that whole life cycle and not, as I say, become another bottleneck after a deployment.
So you would kind of implement that as a one-off or a periodic thing versus part of a pipeline, like a daily or every time?
I see it both ways. Okay. I have. It depends again on, and I say this very lightly, maturity of the customer. Maturity in terms of what they are doing in a DevOps culture. Are they using these types of tools and technology already? Some customers have this as a separate role, meaning your operational teams, your DBAs. This is just another one of those things on the checklist we now have to do. I've got other teams that are very mature that have this as a part of an automated pipeline. Okay, so as I'm doing a deployment to production, a part of that automated process now is to immediately take a brand new refresh image of that production environment that includes our security of masking of data or anything of that nature, and then providing those environments in an automated fashion back down to development tests. So whatever the customer is prepared for, whatever those challenges are, RedGate has the ability to really be able to come in and help.
That's great. You always need to meet the customer where they are.
No doubt.
Yeah, and speaking of touching and pulling on that thread and on that topic a little bit, Chris, I think there's one thing people don't realize is how much business logic code resides or can reside in your database, either with stored procedures, some database functions, even SQL joins for reports, etc. How can you support testing database logic and ensuring that testing data matches the type of data that exists in production that you mentioned?
Yeah, I think in terms of unit tests, this is where we kind of start to talk about that area. So one of the products within the portfolio of RedGate is a product called SQL Test.
Right.
And SQL Test is a framework, or it provides you a framework for doing those unit tests up front for SQL Server. If the community is aware, we work with T-SQL-T. This is an organization out here that's really popular in SQL Server community for really doing a lot of the unit tests that one can run for SQL Server. We also have another framework within SQL Test, which is called SQL Cop, and this is a framework looking for code analysis type rules. I think when we start talking about DevOps and those practices, testing is something that is really overlooked with a lot of my customers, and where testing occurs.
It's not just your customers.
Yeah, it's. I always say that you need to have a very robust testing function within your DevOps lifecycle in order for us. And when I say us, I mean the developers and the operational people. Okay. We both have different things that we care about. Mm-hmm. All right. That's the first thing. But in terms of testing, right, if I can get that integrated as early on in the life cycle, where we can test the logic, behind my stored procedures and my functions, and get that visibility, understand how much of my SQL is being covered by a application test, right? This is fantastic feedback for the developers that allow for them to develop more safely, I should say. And then when I go ahead and present my changes forward for deployment, as I said beforehand, the DBAs, the individuals that are charged with that, they're not going to be surprised by any kind of deployments because we have vetted out those changes early on with tools like SQL Test. I hope that's a proper answer for you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We're big proponents of sunlight is the best disinfectant, and
I've heard that before.
Across your DevOps teams, your DevSecOps teams, the more people looking at what's actually happening, within reason, you hide, credentials and secrets and, certain security-based stuff, but everything else should be out in the open so that everyone can see it and improve upon it and detect any vulnerabilities.
True.
Okay, so no wrong answers, no deducted points or money. That's great.
Yeah, your bank account is intact.
We're into the just the fun question, and we kind of end this every episode with this question, and it's not technical, but in relines to ContinuousX. If there's anything that you could do or want to have as a continuously, what would that be? And it sounds to me like a punishment if it's so pick wisely.
Yeah. If there's anything, if I can say this, is there anything that I can do continuously? What would that be? Would that be a better way to say it?
Or
have?
Yeah.
Coffee comes to mind.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. Here I am, a middle-aged guy, and if I feel like I'm given the the bottle with one wish.
Exactly.
What I wish for, right?
Yeah.
But you can wish for other wishes.
Continual wishes.
Hey, that's awesome.
At the risk of sounding cheesy,
Now that's what this question's dedicated for.
There you go. I think the only thing that I can honestly wish for that can be continuous is just, having the ones that I, care for, just have a fruitful life and to be continuously there for them, be a proper role model, guide them correctly. This is really the only thing that I hope for. The challenge of just the world that we live in altogether is becoming more and more challenging, and just kind of keeping everybody close to me on the straight and narrow, making sure that they're safe and secure. Obviously, this is the only thing that I would continuously hope for in my life.
Wow, that's
a good one.
Not too cheesy, I hope.
A pertinent and well-timed note given the airing of this episode.
Yeah, I want that and coffee.
Good one.
Yours just sounds cheap right now, Fitz. Well, that concludes this episode. We'd like to thank Chris for his time and his thoughts on DevSecOps, and to your listeners for taking the time in another attempt to solve for X in the SDLC equation. On behalf of Mike and the rest of the DLT team, I bid you a good day.